Welcome to episode 167. And today is all about workplace culture because it's one of those business topics that everyone agrees is important, but not many people stop to think about what does it actually mean in practice. And we might hear phrases like toxic culture and high performance culture all the time and think, they've become a little bit like buzzwords. Everyone nods along and everyone assumes that someone else has the toxic culture and of course their business has a high performance culture, but they're not really understanding what that means. And part of the confusion is that when people hear toxic workplace culture, they tend to imagine really extreme examples. Think about bullying, people screaming, terrible bosses, really obvious dysfunction. But toxic culture is often much quieter than that. It shows up as frustration or confusion, disengagement, managers avoiding conversations, teams operating in silos, good employees quietly leaving while their leaders like, I just didn't see that coming. And then on the other side of the conversation, when businesses talk about wanting a high performance culture, sometimes what they actually mean is that they want people to work harder or move faster or just somehow magically become more productive. But the interesting thing is that genuinely high performing cultures don't usually feel chaotic or intense. Most high performing teams actually feel pretty calm. People know what's expected of them, communication is clear, managers are consistent, and problems get addressed before they turn into big issues. So, what I want to do today is really break down the difference between those two environments because there are a lot of businesses that actually sit somewhere in the middle. They might know something's a bit off in their culture, but they can't quite put their finger on what's causing it. And sometimes what's happening is that the business has just slowly drifted into habits and behaviors that are creating friction without anyone really setting out for that to happen. Because culture evolves whether we're intentional about it or not. No one wakes up in the morning, well, I don't think they do, and says, you know what, I want to create a workplace that's really dysfunctional. But culture is shaped every day through our behaviors, communication, systems, leadership actions, and of course, what gets rewarded and tolerated inside our business because these things happen gradually. And so we don't often notice the shift until there are symptoms showing up. And some of those symptoms are things like your employee turnover is increasing. Maybe people stop speaking up in meetings. Maybe customer complaints are rising. Maybe managers just feel like they're constantly firefighting. Or maybe the owner just has this feeling that the energy in the business just isn't what it used to be. And sometimes when I speak to business owners in this situation, they'll say things like, we always had a great culture, but I don't know, something's just a bit off. And that's because culture doesn't change overnight. It actually shifts slowly through repeated experiences that become normalized. And the interesting thing is that research really backs this up. Gallup's latest Australian workplace data found that only 1 in 5 Australian employees describe themselves as engaged at work. So when we talk about people feeling disconnected, frustrated, or just doing the minimum, it's not a small issue in a few workplaces. It's actually quite common. And then there are researchers at MIT Sloan that looked at what predicts whether employers will leave organizations. And they found that toxic culture was more than 10 times powerful than compensation in predicting that turnover. So, although businesses might think people are leaving for more money, they're actually leaving because of the environment they're working in. And this is really important because culture has a direct impact on business performance. Gallup's broader research across thousands of teams globally has found that highly engaged teams have stronger productivity, profitability, and customer outcomes than disengaged teams. And this is consistent with many other pieces of research that I've read over the years. So culture is not this soft, fluffy topic sitting over there, separately from the commercial side of business. It directly impacts the business performance. And I've spoken in other episodes about, the definition of culture being described as, the way that we do things around here. And that is a really simple way to think about it because when someone joins your business, they very quickly learn what behaviors are accepted, what gets rewarded, what gets avoided, and what behaviors are risky. They learn, can I speak honestly? Will my managers listen? Is there accountability? And other values on our website, the reality of the workplace. So when we talk about toxic culture, it's important to understand that it's not one big dramatic event. It's not a workplace that you walk into and you automatically know, oh my goodness, this is so toxic. More commonly, it's a pattern of small behaviors and unresolved issues that slowly erode trust over time. And one of the biggest signs is poor communication. And that's not just people not talking to each other, it is situations where employees don't know what's happening, priorities constantly change, decisions aren't communicated clearly. Leaders assume everyone understands what's going on, but in reality, everyone's operating from different assumptions in different directions. And what tends to happen in those environments is that people fill in the gaps themselves when they don't know the information. And this is where gossip starts. It's where rumors thrive, frustration builds. Teams make different decisions because they've interpreted the information differently. Then leaders get frustrated because people aren't aligned. But the real issue is that the clarity wasn't there. Another really common sign is blame replacing accountability. So something goes wrong, the conversation immediately becomes about, well, whose fault was it? Rather than how do we solve the problem? And once businesses fall into that pattern, people will stop raising issues because they're worried about being blamed. They become defensive, they protect themselves. And so you end up in a culture where people spend more energy avoiding mistakes than actually improving performance and innovating. And one of the most damaging things in workplace culture is inconsistency. When one person gets held accountable for behavior and another person doesn't. And maybe that's because they're technically brilliant, or maybe it's because they've been there for years, or maybe it's because they're a really nice person or they're a great friend. But for whatever reason, leadership doesn't want to have the difficult conversation. And employees notice that. Over time, trust starts to weaken because we no longer believe that expectations are fair or consistent. And if you have silence in your workplace, that is one of the biggest warning signs on culture. But often leaders actually misread it because they think, oh, great, there's no conflict, everyone's happy. But what's actually happening is that people aren't speaking up because they don't think things will change, or they don't feel psychologically safe enough to challenge ideas or raise concerns. So it's important here to also talk about psychosocial risk because in Australia, this conversation has shifted significantly over the last few years. Workplace culture is no longer just something you should care about because it improves engagement or retention. It's also now connected to your work health and safety obligations. So when we talk about psychosocial hazards, that's things like poor support, lack of role clarity, unrealistic workloads, poor workplace relationships, bullying, conflict, low reward and recognition, poor communication, inconsistent leadership. And what's interesting when you listen to that list, many of those things are actually culture issues. So culture isn't just influencing whether employees enjoy coming to work, but it can also create real psychological harm if those risks are left unmanaged over time. So this is one of the reasons why leaders need to stop dismissing culture concerns as people being too sensitive or just needing more resilience, because often employees are actually reacting to ongoing uncertainty, poor communication, inconsistent treatment, or unmanaged conflict. And when that continues for long periods of time, it absolutely impacts on well-being, performance, and retention. Now, if we compare that to a genuinely high-performing culture, because the difference is that high-performing cultures create clarity instead of friction. People know what success looks like. They understand the goals of the business. Managers communicate regularly. Accountability feels supportive, not punitive. And I think that's really important because accountability can get misunderstood a lot. In unhealthy cultures, accountability feels like blame, pressure, micromanagement. But in healthy, high performing cultures, accountability is really just clarity and follow through. We agreed this was important, we agreed on who was responsible, and now we're supporting each other to deliver it. Another thing I notice in high performing teams is that people don't waste huge amounts of emotional energy trying to navigate politics and inconsistency and confusion. They can just focus on doing good work because the environment is stable and predictable. They trust their leaders, they trust each other, and they know that issues will be addressed fairly if something goes wrong. And this is when leadership has such a massive impact on culture because whether they realize it or not, leaders are constantly shaping what employees experience at work. How leaders communicate pressure, handle conflict, whether they avoid difficult conversations, how they role model accountability, it all matters. People are paying attention to those signals even when we think they're not. So culture is shaped through behavior systems and symbols. And that's a really useful framework to think about. Behaviors are things like communication, teamwork, feedback, decision making. Systems are all the HR and people processes that support the business. So recruitment, onboarding, performance discussions, leadership development, recognition. And then the symbols are the signals that people observe every day. Who's getting promoted? What behaviors are rewarded? What behaviors are we tolerating? Because culture is built through consistency between what we say and what people actually experience. So if a business says we care about teamwork, but then only reward individual competition above anything else, then people will notice that disconnect. If a business says well-being matters, but managers regularly send late night messages and create unrealistic workloads, they're going to notice that too. And this is why culture, isn't just a people issue sitting over at HR somewhere, because culture is created through the way the entire business operates. And your recruitment process shapes culture because it determines who comes into the business. Your onboarding shapes it because it teaches people what matters around here. Your performance process because it reinforces behaviors and expectations. And communication rhythms because it determines whether employees feel informed, included, and heard. And this is where many businesses unintentionally create problems for themselves because they assume culture should happen naturally. I'll hire a great person, I'll treat them well. But culture needs structure, it needs consistency, and it needs leaders who are intentional about shaping it. Now, not all high performance cultures are perfect cultures. There are still going to be disagreements, mistakes, difficult conversations. But, in healthy cultures, that's where we're having robust conversations because people are safe enough to feel that they can raise issues. It's all about the differences between how we handle it when issues are raised. Do we gossip about problems? Do we avoid them? Do we blame each other? Do we deal with issues respectfully? Because where we have toxic workplaces, it's where those environments is everyone's just trying to keep the peace. So the problems aren't addressed and they become enormous. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, okay, I can recognize some of those signs in our business, then the first step is to really stop making assumptions about what your culture is and just start reality testing it. One of the biggest gaps we see is that leaders think the culture is one way, whereas the employees experiencing it are saying something else. And that's not because the leaders are bad people, it's just because that once you're more senior in a business, you are naturally filtered in terms of what you're seeing, but also people filter what they say to you and they don't always tell you exactly what's going on. So we need to ask our employees in a safe way. And sometimes that's through third-party focus groups, sometimes it's through surveys. And we ask them how to describe the workplace, what's performing well, what's frustrating them, where does communication break down, and then we need to listen to all that information for patterns. The second thing we need to do is look at friction. So where are the points where there are repeated frustrations in the business? Because toxic culture grows in those unresolved friction points. Maybe organization onboarding is disorganized. Maybe managers aren't confident giving feedback. Maybe communication between departments isn't great. And then finally, I encourage businesses to invest in leadership capability because your managers have one of the biggest impacts on culture and engagement. And yet, so many managers are promoted for their technical ability and not because they've ever actually been taught how to lead people. So some of the biggest cultural improvements come from very simple leadership habits, being taught to leaders so that they can build those skills. Because ultimately, high performance cultures are not built by pushing people harder, they're built by creating an environment where people can do their best work consistency. And that is really the philosophy underneath the Find, Grow, Keep methodology in Amplify HR. At Find, we focus on attracting and selecting the right people. In Grow, we focus on leadership capability and accountability. And in Keep, we focus on creating an environment where people feel valued, supported, and motivated. Because culture is not one initiative, it's not one workshop, it's not walls on a wall. It is repeated experiences people have every single day inside your business. So if you take one thing from today, it is that toxic culture is not always loud and a high performance culture is not always about pressure. The strongest workplaces are usually the ones where people trust each other, communicate clearly, know what's expected, and feel safe enough to speak honestly and solve problems early. If you've received value from this episode, I'd love it if you could leave a rating or a review over Apple Podcasts or Spotify so someone else could also find the episodes to help with their business. And if you'd like support creating a workplace culture that engages and inspires, head on over to amplifyhr.com.au or connect with me on LinkedIn and we can start a conversation.